On February 14, 2009, Thomas passed away due to natural causes at the age of 65. It does not sound strange. Birth, aging, illness, and death, no one can be exempt from them. However, this person's identity made this incident particularly different. He was a convicted murderer who had spent 22 years on death row at San Quentin State Prison. Over the years, it has completely changed a man named Joseph. Joseph was the father of a 12-year-old girl who was brutally murdered by Thomas in 1981. The pain of losing his daughter almost shattered Joseph, but he did not choose to give up. Instead, he saw his daughter as a reason to live. He wanted to see the murderer punished as he deserved. 2 years later, Joseph witnessed Thomas, the murderer of his daughter, being sentenced to death. For Joseph, it was a moment of justice and relief from suffering, a day he would remember forever. However, various problems within the judicial system once again provoked Joseph's anger. First, there was a malfunction in the prison's execution chamber. In 3 years, the prison did not execute any prisoners sentenced to death, including Thomas. After the carpenters finished repairing the execution chamber, the court began to debate whether the lethal injection procedure was constitutional. Later, Thomas continued to file appeals, while Joseph could only sit helplessly in the gallery, watching Thomas exploit loopholes in the legal process to continue delaying the execution of his death sentence. Joseph said angrily, "I attended all the trials, but that guy is still safe and sound in the death row cell, enjoying 3 meals a day, TV and DVD." In 2008, Joseph was interviewed. At that time, it had been exactly 27 years since his daughter was murdered. When faced with questions from the media, especially those concerning Thomas, Joseph did not show any signs of anger, because his emotions had long shifted from the initial anger to deep disappointment and frustration. During the interview, Joseph held his daughter's photo and choked out, "If my daughter were still alive, she would be 40 this year. She could have experienced birthdays, graduations, college, dating, marriage, having children, but I will never see any of that. I will never experience the joy of having grandchildren because she has become an album, forever frozen at the age of 12. Upon learning of Thomas's death, Joseph, who was already 65 years old, said, "Thank God, he will be burned in hell with Satan for a lifetime. I hope he died miserably. I hope he didn't die in his sleep. I really wish that were the case." In 1944, Thomas was born in Bethesda, Maryland. He was abandoned by his parents at a young age and lived in a local foster care institution. Although the environment there was barely sufficient to sustain his survival, Thomas always felt a sense of loneliness from being abandoned, as well as the trauma of abuse and neglect. 5 years later, a government official from Washington, D.C., visited Thomas's foster care agency with his pregnant wife. Since they had no financial burdens and wanted to expand their family, they considered adopting a child. During the evaluation process, the couple was deeply impressed by Thomas, as he not only performed exceptionally well and was intelligent, but also far exceeded his peers in physical stature. Despite the couple's affluent background, they never treated him differently or ignored his feelings, ensuring he had a happy childhood. However, in the late 1950s, the family faced a major setback when the foster father, who was the family's main breadwinner, passed away for unknown reasons. Faced with the loss of her partner and significant financial pressure, Thomas's foster mother had no choice but to move with the 2 boys to Manning Avenue in Bethesda. After returning there, Thomas's mental state changed. It was not because of his difficult family circumstances, as Thomas had lived in foster care since childhood, but because he had lost an important source of emotional support. As a boy abandoned by his parents, the death of his foster father made Thomas feel extremely insecure and abandoned once again. And these factors led to the gradual collapse of his psychological defenses. Later, Thomas, who had entered puberty, experienced extreme emotional instability due to physical changes and psychological stress. So he began randomly attacking local children with a black bullwhip and intimidating them. Although the children reported Thomas' behavior to their parents, the kind-hearted neighbors sympathized with Thomas' foster mother, who had to care for 2 children alone, so they did not intervene to stop Thomas. However, it was precisely because of this indulgence that Thomas's inner boldness grew. He began using shotguns and bows, highly lethal weapons, and his actions no longer confined themselves to intimidation, but escalated into outright attacks. In 1962, one evening, a girl's backyard was transformed into a temporary Girl Scout campsite. The girls were playing around the tents. A teenager named Barbara stood by one side of the tent, sharing her toys with her friends. However, Thomas approached them silently, holding a knife in his hand. He grabbed Barbara from behind and covered her mouth with his palm, preventing her from making a sound. He first cut off her ponytail and then slit open the tent and fled. But a girl recognized Thomas' identity. Shortly thereafter, based on Barbara's mother's report, the police immediately located Thomas and arrested him. Later, Thomas was sent to Springfield State Hospital for a psychiatric evaluation to determine whether he was competent to stand trial. However, puzzlingly, the charges against Thomas were dropped for unknown reasons. 2 years later, on January 22, 1963, Thomas conspired with two friends to rob a bowling alley manager named Richard. During the robbery, one of the friends wanted to strike Richard on the head with a bowling ball, causing him to fall into a coma. Although the bowling ball ultimately only struck his shoulder, Richard collapsed in pain on the ground. The three then fled the scene with a bag they mistakenly believed contained receipts, but the bag only contained a pair of bowling shoes. Initially, the robbery case remained at a standstill for a long time, until September of the same year, when one of Thomas' friends was arrested by the police for an unrelated crime, which led to the discovery of Thomas and another friend's robbery, and then they were sent to a reformatory. In 1968, Thomas was transferred to Midway House in Baltimore, where Thomas met a man named Martin, who was the key to the police's arrest of Thomas later. Once, Martin claimed that Thomas was a kind and gentle man, nicknamed Teddy Bear, and was intelligent, but he had a strong sexual anger problem toward women. January 16, 1970, was an ordinary day for 14-year-old Sherry. She dressed as usual and set off for the apartment near the Montgomery Shopping Center. Her friend was babysitting there, and she wanted to visit and help her. Although spending time with friends is always wonderful, this time, the two girls got into an argument over something as trivial as who should use the phone. And in the end, Sherry left for home alone, feeling unhappy. The Cabin John Creek Regional Park, usually a playground for children, but became the final destination of Sherry's life on that day. As Sherry walked alone in the empty park, Thomas appeared behind her without warning. His eyes showed no mercy, only cold malice. Before Sherry could scream for help, he forcibly took her away. What happened next was extremely brutal. Thomas was like a demon. He stabbed Sherry in the head with an ice pick, a total of 7 times. Even with her head covered in blood, but he did not stop. He first slit her throat and then fired a handgun at her. And in the end, he left her body on the highway. Later that day, a passing motorist found Sherry's body on the highway with the ice pick still lodged in her head. Due to the extremely poor weather conditions on the day of the incident, heavy fog and rain posed significant challenges to the investigation. In order to get clues, the police made a plan. They put Sherry's clothes on the mannequin and put it on a local TV show. On TV, the mannequin dressed in Sherry's clothes stood there quietly, waiting for someone to recognize her and provide even the slightest information about the killer. The public was also engulfed in endless speculation. Some believed that Sherry might have chosen to hitchhike due to the fog and heavy rain, and the owner of that hitchhiked vehicle was the killer. 12 days later, a shocking tragedy shattered the tranquility of Bethesda. The body of Catherine, a 33-year-old schoolteacher, was discovered lying on her side in the back seat of a neighbor's car. Her throat had been brutally slit, and her chest and legs were covered with 124 wounds. Her apartment was also drenched in blood, and a blood-stained knife was abandoned in one of the rooms. Just 1 day earlier, Catherine had been reported missing. She was supposed to have gone to her new workplace at Tacoma Park Middle School in the District of Columbia, but she never arrived there. According to the coroner's later revelation, Catherine likely met her untimely end while returning home after purchasing groceries. The killer attacked her from behind, striking her on the back of the head and rendering her unconscious. She was then dragged into her apartment kitchen, where the killer brutally slit her throat with a kitchen knife. The killer then stabbed her 6 times in the abdomen and 3 times in the chest, causing her to bleed to death. However, the killer's cruelty did not end there. He dragged her body into the bedroom and continued to brutally hack at it for at least half an hour. On February 2nd, 1970, in the early morning of Alexandria, Donna, an 18-year-old girl who was an employee of the FBI, lost her life forever on this day. That morning, Donna's body was found in her apartment. She was completely naked, covered in stab wounds, and blood stained the floor around her. Most shocking of all, a 3-inch sewing scissors was stuck in her wound. The entire room was in disarray, as if a fierce struggle had taken place. The news spread quickly, and people were discussing it on the streets, comparing it to similar cases that had recently occurred in Maryland, where the victims had also suffered brutal violence. On a chilly morning in November of the same year, a shocking news story sent shockwaves through the community. An unnamed suspect had been detained by police on suspicion of murdering Sherry and Catherine. Police claimed that fingerprints found at the scene linked the suspect closely to the crime scene. Although the suspect's name was not disclosed, according to sources familiar with the matter, the suspect was Thomas, and during a search of his home in Bethesda, police discovered various knives and firearms. Although Thomas was not formally charged with murder due to insufficient evidence, he was imprisoned until 1977, when the state passed a new regulation prohibiting the detention of prisoners with mental illnesses beyond their designated sentences, regardless of whether they were considered a potential threat. Under this, Thomas and 39 other men were released on July 1st. This decision caused extreme unease among prison staff, who were well aware of Thomas's dangerous nature. Thomas had repeatedly confided in them that he had a violent alter ego, which he referred to as a beast. He claimed that whenever he saw a woman, especially a brunette, this beast would be awakened, plunging him into an uncontrollable state of rage. After his release, he formed a relationship with a girl named Lisa. They moved to the sunny Huntington Beach in California. At first, Thomas tried to adapt to his new life, but his paranoid delusions once again took hold of him, causing him to feel constantly on edge at work. And an accidental workplace injury left Thomas with permanent scars on his hands, rendering him unable to work. The pressures of life quickly tore the family apart. His wife, Lisa, left him secretly without saying a word. Thomas, who had lost his wife and his job, gradually lost himself. He began to contact Martin frequently, pouring out his inner pain and confusion. During that period, Thomas took his dog, drove a camper van, moved into the forest. Later, according to Martin's recollection, Thomas stayed in the forest because he wanted to prevent his violent personality from reappearing. Later, due to Thomas' passion for the land, he unexpectedly obtained a job as a forest shooting range official at a gun club. Soon, a club employee named Richard discovered Thomas's unusual behavior. He often saw Thomas secretly taking photos of young girls and women, monitoring people who came camping, but Richard did not reveal this to anyone, and these actions were not illegal. On September 19, 1981, in the Cleveland National Forest, 12-year-old Vanessa and Kelly were walking together along a winding dirt road. Then, an old truck slowly pulled up and stopped less than 10 feet away from them. The person in the driver's seat leaned out and shouted for them to come over. But as they approached, the man pulled out a gun, aimed it at their heads, pulled the trigger, and struck them in the head. Fortunately, a passerby witnessed the entire incident. Although he was shaken, he quickly recovered, noted the car's license plate number, and immediately called the police and emergency services. Based on the witness's description and the license plate number, the police quickly identified the suspect, Thomas, who had suffered severe injuries to his hands. Meanwhile, the two girls were rushed to the hospital. Vanessa was taken to Mission Community Hospital in Mission Viejo, but her injuries were too severe, and despite the doctor's best efforts, she sadly passed away that afternoon. Kelly underwent cranial surgery at another hospital and was the only one to survive. Also, Vanessa and Kelly's classmates and friends were devastated. They decided to do what they could to help with the case, so they took action and raised a reward for anyone who could help catch the killer. In just a few days, they raised $300. Police across the country were also closely monitoring the case and doing everything they could to help find Thomas. In order to avoid the police, Thomas boarded a bus bound for College Park, Maryland. After several hours of bumpy travel, he dragged his weary body to a day's inn. He knew that he could not hide forever, so he picked up the phone and dialed two numbers, one for his former inmate and the other for Martin. He told them, I'm at the Days Inn in College Park, Maryland, and I don't know what to do next." Just after Thomas revealed his whereabouts, a heavily armed state police surrounded his place in less than an hour. After being brought to the interrogation room, Thomas said, "I've been suffering from frequent headaches lately, and I also experience periodic fainting spells. I really can't remember what happened." He tried to use such excuses to exonerate himself, but Martin saw through his intentions. He was well aware of Thomas's intelligence and knew that he had long mastered those psychiatric terms. During his time in prison, Thomas had frequently used these terms to manipulate others, making them believe he was mentally unstable. Therefore, Martin said, "Thomas, I know what you're doing. You're skilled at using these terms to confuse others, but this time, you won't fool anyone." After Thomas confessed to the crime, his lawyers fought vigorously on his behalf, attempting to prevent Thomas from being extradited to California for trial, while also rejecting media requests for Thomas to be interviewed. However, these efforts ultimately proved unsuccessful. Thomas was still extradited to California and stood trial there. After the trial, Thomas was found guilty of murder and attempted murder. However, since the jury members could not reach a consensus on sentencing, the court decided to have a new jury conduct a second sentencing trial. In the second trial, Thomas made a shocking decision. He dismissed his public defender and refused to defend himself, which directly led to his death sentence. But at the last moment before the verdict was handed down, Thomas suddenly requested to hire a new public defender. A defender named Michael was selected, and he persuaded the court to arrange a third sentencing trial. During the third trial, the prosecutor presented additional evidence in court regarding Thomas's disturbing behavior, revealing a chilling truth. During his marriage to Lisa, Thomas had engaged in a perverted sexual game. He would pretend to tie Lisa up, then slit her throat, watching her bleed, while Lisa desperately begged for mercy. These horrifying acts left everyone present feeling chilled to the bone, and Thomas was once again sentenced to death. In the end, the pickup truck that Thomas had driven was abandoned in a vehicle graveyard. There, among many other cars once used by serial killers, the most famous were those belonging to Randy and William. These vehicles lay there silently, each telling a chilling story of their owners, and Thomas's pickup truck had also become part of those cars. At first, the cases of Sherry and Catherine had reached a complete dead end, until 1985, when the police decided to reopen the investigation into Sherry's murder. They identified Thomas as a major suspect and sought any evidence that could link him to the case. As early as 1970, when the police conducted an initial search of Thomas's residence, they found a green military jacket with a small bloodstain on it. However, due to the lack of advanced testing technology at the time, the jacket did not attract much attention. So, the police retrieved the green military jacket from the evidence room and sent the bloodstains on the jacket for testing. After a lengthy wait, although the match was not considered perfect, the high degree of similarity was sufficient for the experienced police officers to conclude that Thomas was connected to the murder. In January 2012, the police officially closed the case, and Thomas was identified as the murderer of Sherry and Catherine. But Donna's case has never been clued.